So the other day I took on the lofty task of ranking every single movie in Marvel Studios' Infinity Saga. I was able to summarize my thoughts on each and every MCU movie in about 3 minutes or less each time. Because while I do love these movies, admittedly, they're all pretty much simple enough for me to identify just one thing that I like or don't like about each movie to determine the ranking. However, I saved my top ranked film from the series Avengers Infinity War for a video of its own, because I have just so much to say about it. So here's that video. Today I'll be diving into several key components of Avengers Infinity War and why I like them so much to the point where I believe it makes Infinity War not only the best MCU movie of all time, but also the best comic book movie of all time. So let's get into it. It's pretty hard to separate Infinity War from Endgame, since even before the movies were out, they were promised to be a part 1 and a part 2 of a continuous story, released within a year of each other. So naturally it was destined that they would be connected. However, I think that Infinity War is more than deserving of being seen as a movie of its own, and I think it's very much a superior experience to Endgame. To start off, Endgame, to be honest, is pretty weirdly paced. That's not really at the fault of the movie. Each segment is different because the movie had a lot to wrap up. So we expect all of these things to be wrapped up in these distinct segments, with each one of them crafted essentially to fulfill our expectations. First, it was about how the world and the Avengers responded to the snap. Then Act 2 is about how they'd reverse the snap, which we knew they would. And of course, Act 3 is about how they'd wrap up the entire MCU Infinity Saga, how they'd have the biggest battle against Thanos, and then give a satisfying ending to at least 2 of the big 3. Meaning Thor, Cap, and Iron Man, which they did. I want to be clear, this is not an example of bad pacing or tone at all. However, the way in which these 3 acts are so distinct from one another make the movie feel a little jarring, because the transitions are so abrupt. Plus, like I said, the ending, while satisfying, definitely fulfills what we expect. We already knew that these stones would be used again to revive the Fallen, we already knew that there'd be a giant climactic battle against Thanos where he was defeated once and for all, and we also knew that most, if not all of the core Avengers would die or retire in the process. Granted, we didn't know the specifics of who or how it would happen, but again, all of these story beats were something that we expected to be fulfilled during Endgame. In my review of the movie in the last video, I compared Endgame more so to a sporting event rather than a narrative media experience. Like when you're watching your favorite team during a good season, you know that they'll likely win most of their big games by scoring points. You don't know which player is going to score during which game, or when in the game, but statistically you expect these things to happen, and then they celebrate when they play out in the way that you'd probably expect them to. So while I don't dislike Endgame by any means, I think Infinity War is simply the better narrative story, and I think it has a more consistent tone, so it fixes every complaint that I just had about Endgame. So let's dive into how it does that specifically. Let's start that off by talking about the pacing of Infinity War. Most Marvel movies are framed in one of 2 ways. It's either the origin story or the continuation story. Each of these revolves around the basic plot structure of a setup, conflict, and resolution in their own ways. In the origin stories, we're introduced to a person who becomes a hero, and then they come into conflict with a villain, and the resolution to that initial conflict then defines them as a hero going forward. And in the continuation stories, we're introduced to the hero as they were at the end of their origin story. Then the middle portion is a plot thread from the previous movie that comes into play, and it acts as the conflict. And then the resolution of the movie determines whether or not that new thing that was introduced was significant enough to transform the hero into a new status quo. Either way, these movies are all framed in a very traditional sense, where there is a clear narrative pause at the beginning of the movie, before the conflict, and then there's a narrative pause after the movie, to determine what's going to happen going forward. However, Infinity War has neither of these. Because the movie is framed around a single battle, if you think about it, the entirety of the movie is Thanos' fight with portions of the Avengers, both on Earth and Titan. That conflict with Thanos is actually just a small sliver of the larger hero's journey of Thanos on his quest to obtain the 6 Infinity Stones. So the beginnings of the movie actually feel like what would have been the middle portion of pretty much any other MCU movie, since the movie opens up on the Asgardian ship with Thanos already having obtained the Power Stone off screen, and within 10 minutes he kills Loki, defeats Thor and Hulk, and obtains the second of 6 Infinity Stones, the plot isn't set into motion by the end of the first act. It's already in motion by the time the movie starts, and we're just along for the ride. I'm certainly not the first person on the internet to remark that this is a Thanos movie where we follow him as an unstoppable force, dealing with the Avengers, rather than an Avengers movie where we follow them and see them discover and set into motion the Thanos conflict through their perspective. I think that part of the movie is genius, since right off the bat, it makes very clear that our familiar heroes are only the background characters. Like, if you think about it, most of the Avengers movies are centered around either Steve Rogers or Tony Stark. So if Infinity War was framed around one of them, and then we cut to the Guardians of the Galaxy, it would have felt really jarring. In other Avengers movies, you see the characters interact with each other in moments of narrative stagnation, like the party scene in Age of Ultron or in the helicarrier scenes in the first Avengers movies. In those scenes, you know that it's likely that nothing bad will happen, and instead we're following what's on screen to get jokes, character development, or at least set something up that will happen later on. But in Infinity War, the only time that you see characters like this is in brief moments either right before they launch themselves into the line of action, such as Spider-Man on the bus before he joins Iron Man, or when they're actually about to be the targets of our main focus, Thanos and the Black Order, like when Doctor Strange is targeted in New York for the Time Stone, or Wanda and Vision in Scotland for the Mind Stone. The fact that the movie establishes this precedent so well and so clearly is so refreshing because it's so different from other Marvel movies. Infinity War, I'd say, is the only truly subversive MCU movie. Avengers 1 we knew would end with the team assembling. Age of Ultron is a straightforward battle against Ultron, and Endgame had to resolve everything from Infinity War and serve as the finale for the MCU. So the entire movie kind of feels like means to an expected end. However, Infinity War, for everything that I just mentioned, is so different from the other ones. Speaking of subversion, I've heard a lot of people say that the movie feels a bit shallow at times, because by the end, the only dead heroes were the ones with continuing stories going forward, so we knew it wouldn't be permanent. Like, why should we buy into the drama of the snap when the dusted Spider-Man and Black Panther both have future movies coming out? Well, I'd say that if you only look at movies from that perspective, as an audience member with the knowledge of external production nuances, you're missing out on the story that the filmmakers are trying to create in that story's universe. And internally, Infinity War sells the effects of the snap pretty well. As far as the remaining characters at the end of the film are aware, these events are devastating and irreversible. Same goes for Thanos. If you ever think about the fact that the Avengers are a Disney property, and therefore there's no way that the Avengers won't win at the end of the next movie, you're overlooking the incredible last scene of the movie where Thanos is on his farm. And as far as he knows at this point in time in the movie, he's won. Permanently. Immersing yourself in their perspective makes for the most compelling ending to any MCU movie by far. And on the topic of perspective, I've seen a lot of complaints that the lack of focus on the heroes is a bad thing, since it's disappointing to see the return for so many of them without proper character arcs. However, I don't think that's really a bad thing. In fact, the stuff that I mentioned about heroes being framed as background characters is great, alongside the fact that that jump between different focuses actually contributes to making Infinity War feel like what it's supposed to be, a crossover comic event. We see these characters pop up and interact with one another in new pairings that we haven't seen before, and that we'll never see again, like Star-Lord and Spider-Man, and Iron Man and Doctor Strange. Each one of them very clearly follows the portrayal and arcs established in their past appearances. So it's okay that none of them really have arcs within this movie, because I think it's an amazing feat that they all honor where the character was in their last appearance. What more could you ask for in a crossover? We know the spot that Thor was in at the end of Ragnarok, and the spot that Star-Lord was in at the end of Guardians 2. So seeing them together is fun, because it gives them well-established dynamics to play off of. And as an audience member, you understand the nuances of these interactions well if you've done your homework and seen all the past movies. Then it really pays off. Again, it's like a well-written comic book crossover. Rather than waste panels explaining why each character is at the place they're at, and stagnating the narrative, which, like I mentioned before, Infinity War definitely doesn't do, instead it trusts that the audience understands their nuances, backstories, dynamics, and personalities well, before thrusting them into new environments and seeing how they'll respond based off of how we know they generally act. Seeing the Taika Waititi depiction of Thor, the Russo brothers' depiction of Falcon, and the James Gunn depiction of Rocket all thrust into the exact same conflict is simply exciting for the same reason that we enjoy reading comics as a kid. This movie knows that the MCU has so many different sides to it. They're all made to fit into the Thanos story, but none of them are watered down or written inconsistently because of it. Infinity War feels like a living, breathing comic book because of these pairings and crossovers. So focusing a great deal on the fun and potential of these interactions makes for something really fun. Even after rewatching it over and over, I feel like none of the crossover novelty ever wears off, and in fact it might be my favorite aspect of the movie. Unlike Endgame, which only has the big crossover in the third act battle, where the heroes are just doing a straightforward sci-fi battle together, Infinity War instead has crossovers in a more multi-dimensional way, where characters can joke together, they can fight together, they can be sad together, and they can lose together. Movies with more depth, like The Dark Knight, are great comic book adaptations, meaning storylines from comic books that are loosely reimagined into darker, more nuanced cinematic perspectives. Even some MCU movies do this. For example, Thor Ragnarok takes inspiration from Planet Hulk, but creates a narrative about colonization, imperialism, and royalty. And Guardians of the Galaxy takes inspiration from various cosmic Marvel comics, and reappropriates all of them as a means to tell a story about a found family. But Infinity War is the greatest one-to-one comic book movie of all time, meaning it feels like a comic book playing out on a live screen, with the purpose of the movie not to reimagine comic book storylines into different genres, but instead to tell a very compelling crossover in the comic genre. However, Infinity War is by no means shallow because of that lack of undertone. It can get away with not being an adaptation because it's so committed to its format of simply being a great live-action crossover. Even when I watch this movie now, I can see each scene as comic panels, because the movie is paced, edited, shot, and scripted like a comic book. And that's really exciting to me. So for all those reasons, Avengers Infinity War stands alone as the greatest MCU and greatest comic book movie of all time to me. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective and the finale to my rankings of every MCU movie. It's been a long process, but I'm excited to move forward with new content. So stay tuned for that, and for updates about what I'm making a video on and when I'm doing it, make sure to join the official Tam Valley Discord. I'll put the link in the description below. I've also got merch and a Twitter account, also in the description below, so check those out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for more content.